Hello and welcome to True Crime in Science, our new show that discusses real-life cases but delves further into the forensic details behind them. I'm your host, Eleanor Higgs.
And I'm Chris Carpinetti, and today we're going to look into the case of serial killer John Wayne Gacy, aka the Killer Clown, and how forensic anthropology techniques were employed to find him.
John Gacy was born in 1942 in Chicago, USA. He was close to his mother, but his father struggled with alcoholism and would beat John and his two sisters. He also frequently taunted John for being stupid and made disparaging comparisons between him and his sisters. John was bedbound a lot as a child due to a congenital heart condition, which led to him being unable to play sports or mingle with other children his own age. Later in life, Gacy went on to attend Northwestern Business College and got engaged to a woman named Marilyn Myers, with whom he had two children. Marlin's father owned the KFC restaurants, which Gacy ended up managing. He also became a member of the Waterloo United States Junior Chamber, also known as the Jaycees, which is a community non-profit organisation dedicated to helping the community.
In 1968, Gacy was accused of sexually assaulting a teenage boy, who was the son of one of his fellow Jaycees. He was convicted and received a 10-year prison sentence, after which his wife divorced him and he never saw her or their two children again. Due to garnering the reputation of a model prisoner, Gacy only served 18 months of his sentence. He was granted parole with probation, which included a nightly curfew. However, he was arrested again in early 1971 for luring and attempting to coerce another teenage boy into sex, but the charges were dropped as the boy did not show up for trial. He was also arrested and charged later that year, June 1971, but the case was dropped as the person wanted to try and blackmail him. His parole ended in 1971 with the Iowa Board of Parole not learning about the 1971 incidents. When his parole ended, his records were sealed. Following this, Gacy remarried and ended up buying a house in Illinois and started a construction business. Most of his employees were young men who he would proposition and sometimes make violent threats against. He then became a building contractor and went into politics as a captain of the Democratic precinct.
In 1975, he became a member of the Jolly Joker Clown Club, where he would perform in clown attire and make-up at children's parties, charity functions and other events as his alter egos Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown. We will now move on to the victims of Gacy. Tragically, so many people succumbed to his wickedness, so we will just give an overview of what happened to some of his victims who have now been identified. 1972 was Gacy's first known murder. Gacy lured 16-year-old Timothy McCoy from a Greyhound bus terminal to his car. Gacy took McCoy on a sightseeing tour before bringing him back to his house. Gacy killed McCoy the following morning after falsely thinking McCoy was threatening him with a knife, though this is Gacy's own testimony, so we cannot be certain of its authenticity. Gacy then buried the body in his own crawl space. After he had finished, he had realised he experienced sexual gratification from the killing, and that is when his killing spree started.
A later victim by the name of John Butkovich, who was employed by Gacy, was invited into his house to discuss overdue pay. Gacy then gave him alcohol and tricked him into putting on handcuffs to show him a magic trick. He then strangled Butkovich and placed the body in the concrete floor of the tool room extension. This became a frequent method Gacy used to kill his victims. Between 1976 and 1978, during his second divorce, Gacy committed the most murders. He started to lure more and more young men and boys to his house, and after he killed them, he would bury them on his property. One of his victims, a 17-year-old PDM employee named Gregory Godzik, had been employed by Gacy to dig trenches in the crawl space at his home. It was later found out that this space was in fact used to make space for graves.
In March 1978, Gacy and 26-year-old Jeffrey Rignall. Rignall was dumped in Chicago Park, unconscious but alive, and Gacy was arrested for assault and battery in July 1978 and he awaited trial. However, this was before the police uncovered more of his crimes. Once he had no more space for graves, he started throwing his victims in Des Plaines River, apparently 5 in total. On December 11, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Peast went missing. Peast had told his mother he was going to meet a contractor to discuss a potential construction job. When he did not come back home, Peast's family filed a missing persons report with the police. Gacy had employed Peast for his job in earshot of a man named Phil Torf, Peast's current employer at the pharmacy, and Torf named Gacy as the contractor of Peast to the police. This was the case that finally led to the capture of Gacy.
The police got a search warrant for Gacy's home, where they found several suspicious items including hypodermic needles, handcuffs, police badges, and a starter pistol. They discovered a receipt that had belonged to Piest, contradicting Gacy's claims that he had no contact with him. Now with their suspicions roused, they started to survey him. Gacy tried to influence the officers, regularly inviting them to meals and frequently denying any claims against him. However, the evidence mounted up against him, and the police eventually issued him with a second search warrant. It was during this search that the police found several trenches filled with remains in the crawl space beneath his house. 26 bodies were found in Gacy's crawl space, with 3 more bodies found elsewhere on his property.
Police then called forensic anthropologists Charles Warren and Clyde Snow. Snow compiled a chart for every skull found and checked them against missing persons reports, but could not work out who the remaining 9 victims were. So they called in forensic artist Betty Pat Gatliff. She used facial reconstruction methods to form basic structures to distribute to the public. However, some of these victims are still unnamed today. Gacy eventually confessed to killing about 30 people. He tried to appeal to the courts that he was insane, but after a lengthy amount of psychological testing, they found him to be sane and responsible for his crimes. He was found guilty of committing 33 murders and was imprisoned for 14 years before being executed by lethal injection in 1994.
Gacy is known as one of the most ruthless serial killers in American history. He caused people such turmoil as many families had to live for years without knowing what had happened to their missing loved ones. While the answer to that question is horrific, it was because of the techniques of forensic anthropology that the question was at least answered at all, as by the time police found the bodies in Gacy's home, they had decayed into only bones. We will now discuss how forensic anthropology works and in what cases it can come in useful. When human remains are found that consist only of bony skeletons or parts of, then a forensic anthropologist uses science to identify the deceased, whether it be victims of disasters, homicide, or even non-suspicious circumstances. The primary role of a forensic anthropologist is the systematic study of skeletal or fragmentary remains. They create biological profiles of the deceased. These profiles will include things like sex, age when they died, ancestry, and stature. They also look into time of death, cause of death, trauma and pathology, along with the possible identification of the person. Forensic anthropologists can also work for private companies to help analyse human remains using a variety of techniques, which we'll discuss shortly, for universities and museums.
1886 is considered to be the year forensic anthropology became a certified subfield, when Dr. Jeffries Wyman testified in a murder trial after he'd analysed the victim's burnt and unburnt bones and confirmed his identity with the victim's dentist, who had made false teeth for the victim. Technology swiftly became more advanced when X-ray was invented in the late 19th century. It was soon used in forensics. Human remains were later identified through X-ray technology by comparing the victim's X-ray scans of when they were alive to new ones taken after they died. X-rays were also useful in identifying any trauma that caused damage to the skeleton. In 1972, CT scanning was also used by forensic anthropologists, and the subdiscipline of forensic anthropology was added to the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. In 1984, Dr. Clyde Snow, who you'll remember from the John Gacy case, went to Argentina and recruited university students, and together they brought justice to tens of thousands of people who disappeared by their government in the 1970s.
Forensic anthropologists often work as part of a team. The police will conduct a preliminary investigation where they will interview witnesses, family members, and survivors to get a feel of what happened. If they're struggling in where to look, forensic archaeologists will use different techniques to search for and recover human remains. The techniques can range from non-invasive to invasive techniques. These include map analysis, aerial photography, field observation, geophysical survey techniques, and manual techniques, as in more destructive ground probes and dogs. If the body still has muscle mass and soft tissue, it will often go to the forensic pathologist first, but if it's mainly skeletal, then it will pass on to a forensic anthropologist. Forensic anthropologists will firstly make sure that the bones are human. With smaller fragments, this may be more difficult. This can be done by looking at the anatomy or serological tests, that is, if they're recent enough and not burnt. Once the remains have been identified as human, general characteristics are identified, such as height, age, sex, ancestry, followed by more individualized features, such as dentistry, anatomical structure, previous bone injury or disease, or surgical implants. that can lead to identification. Techniques like X-ray, MRI, and CT technology can be employed to analyse them. However, the biggest aid to forensic anthropologists has been the use of DNA testing to help identify people. Good sources of DNA include dental pulp and bone marrow, although other sources can be used. Sometimes bodies can be badly decomposed and DNA samples can be compromised, so other techniques of identification are still heavily relied on. Forensic anthropologists will also need good communication skills to convey their finding to a multidisciplinary team or to the public.
There have been countless other cases where methods of forensic anthropology have been employed. In 1985, a woman was found dead in Tennessee, USA. The police took her fingerprints and took note of her hair and eye colour, but could not identify her, so they brought her body to an anthropology facility known as the Body Farm. This is a research facility that does systemic study into human decomposition. The initial facility was created by Dr. Bill Bass in 1981 at the University of Tennessee. They helped estimate that she was about 20 years old at the time of her death, and her remains were kept there until they made a breakthrough in 2018 when they finally matched her prints, taken by the Tennessee's investigators in 1985, to that of a person who was arrested in 1983. The victim's name was Tina Marie Farmer, and authorities believed she was associated with the Red Head murders, which were a series of unsolved crimes in the south of the US between 1978 and 1992.
Forensic anthropologists can also determine the cause of death and possible identities of people dating back centuries. In 1996, a skeleton was found in Jamestown, Virginia, USA. Forensic anthropologists could tell much about that person. He was a man, and he was tall for the time at nearly 5'9". From muscle attachment points, they deduced he had a strong physique and determined he was between 18 to 20 years old. He showed no sign of disease, yet his cause of death was clear. He had a broken leg with no sign of healing and had shards of a lead shot embedded in the bone. They now believe this to be a man named George Harrison, who died in a duel in the 1600s.
So the fact that forensics can determine the cause of death and identities of people from so far back is nothing short of remarkable. It is just another show of how forensic anthropology has been an immensely useful field for over a century, helping us to better understand the history of the world whilst also bringing justice to criminals and closure for those in grieving, such as for many of the families of the victims of John Wayne Gacy. There have been many advancements in the field over the years, and hopefully exciting ones to come.
Forensic anthropologist Mercedes Mimi Doretti, who has worked on many high-profile cases, confirmed the importance of forensic anthropology by stating, "It matters to all of us, even if we may not have had someone who's disappeared in our family." Thank you for watching this episode of True Crime in Science. Please subscribe for more videos like this one.